James and I were physically dragged down the other end of the compound, almost to where we had started, and we were thrown into a cell. I was able to make some life-changing decisions because the truth was that there was many legal officers in my core, being a lifelong journey well into my 50s, which is the decade that I'm in now.
And we typically reflect on our parents and as we observe them as our role models. So what was that relationship with your father?
They were the ones, through their eyes, I saw the world initially. Taught me a lot about dignity, grace, the importance to make space for humour at times is something that stayed with me and absolutely has shaped me my whole life.
And that's normal.
Yes.
That's life. That's being human.
But the children eventually become the teachers as well.
Yes.
And I know that that has also happened.
Traveled in Europe a lot, but when you're moving to Iraq and then staying there for more than a year, paint that picture in terms of the resilience, the challenges in that nation.
And the judge said, that person is Major Rabia, which is what they called me. You send her in, I'll speak to her. Great. And the decisions that you make in those moments when you are called upon will define your character. In the years and years that I've served people, biggest challenge that comes up again and again and again is the erosion of trust. I think that is the biggest existential threat that we face in the world.
Welcome, Rabia. How are you?
Lovely to see you, Dev. Thank you. I'm really well, thank you.
Thank you for your time today, and so glad that we're having this conversation.
You're welcome.
You have a fairly, diverse experience across armed forces and, what you've been doing now. Could you also talk, before we go into deep dive into specifics, could you, elaborate on your background and your story?
Sure.
And then be as descriptive as you want to. There's no hurry.
Okay. So I'm the eldest of two children.
Mm-hmm.
My father is an Indian Muslim migrant. My mother is an Anglo-Saxon Australian.
Mm-hmm.
I lived my early years in India, and as we were approaching the sort of mid-70s, as I was approaching school age, my parents decided to leave India to immigrate here to Australia. So we arrived here in the mid-1970s when something called the White Australia policy was still very much alive. And I guess for me, that was a very pivotal time in my life because that policy for those of us that came to Australia from non-European countries meant this real tangible pressure and expectation to fit in. And that was easier said than done when you came to this country with brown skin, an unusual name, an accent. And I remember in those early days, as a child, seeing the world very much through my parents' eyes, particularly Dad, dark-skinned, Muslim, immigrant, educated. But Dad suffered a lot of prejudice and discrimination and I'd probably say ignorance for quite a number of years. And he handled it with a lot of dignity and a lot of humility, but it was clear to me that there were wounds inflicted during those times. Mm-hmm. And I think seeing that formed the seeds of what later became my passion and commitment for equality and social justice. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the beginning. Mm-hmm. I did my schooling here, my university here. I had some tough times growing up as a child. I was sexually abused by a neighbour at the age of 9. Mm-hmm. This neighbour exploited our situation as immigrants. We had no family around. My parents both worked 2 jobs. By then, I had a little brother who was 8 years younger than me, and I used to look after him for a few hours here and there until Mum or Dad could come home. So he really exploited our situation and my innocence, and we were very fond of him and his wife, who were our neighbours, who were really probably our only support network back in those early years. So that was a tough time, and when eventually, after many, many months, I told my parents, and I only found my voice to tell them because I realised that I couldn't protect my brother anymore with my silence. Mm-hmm. So I remember telling them, and of course they were heartbroken and mortified, but they were also really conscious that we were still a family of outsiders. We hadn't quite yet been embraced into the community as new Australians, and back then we didn't speak of things like sexual abuse. There was so much shame and stigma. So a decision was made to sweep it under the rug, to never speak of it. I was told to never share what had happened to me. The police were never called. Pop was never, I called him Pop. He was never brought to justice. Mm-hmm. And that was tough because already at that age, I felt like a square peg in a round hole. I didn't quite fit. I felt a little bit like a loner and a misfit. And so in the years that followed after that, this sense of powerlessness over my life and this sense of having no voice really grew, and it started consuming me. And I was probably heading down a path and almost certainly heading towards a trajectory where this abuse and the silence that was required from me would have completely destroyed me. But fortunately, that's when my parents made a very important decision for me, which was to change my environment. They sent me to another school. And that, I believe, quite possibly saved my life. This school was amazing. Through its leaders, through everyone in the community, they created this authentic environment of belonging and inclusion. They were absolutely committed to embracing and celebrating every student's differences as uniqueness. And at this pivotal time, so I would have been 12 or 13, my life changed. It was the first time in the first place where I felt like I belonged and that people believed in me. And as a result of that, I started believing that perhaps I was worthy of better treatment than I had received and maybe even capable of having some dreams for my life. And at this time, thanks to the people that created this incredible environment that I thrived in, I was able to make some life-changing decisions. And the first of those was that I decided that I was no longer going to allow this injustice to define me. That somehow, and I didn't know exactly how at that point, but somehow I was going to turn it into a positive legacy for change in my life. The next major decision that I remember making before I left school, so now I'm sort of 16, 17, was that I wanted to dedicate my life to serving others and to helping others access justice and find their voice, I guess in ways that I hadn't. And my final year of school was also life-shaping for me because I was elected school captain. And that was a big deal back in those days because I went to a Uniting Church school and I was the first non-Christian to be elected as school captain, something that no one ever thought would happen. So for me, what the meaning that I made of that was that people believed in me and perhaps saw something in me that I hadn't quite yet fully identified in myself. That was my first taste of leadership.
Can I also just pause on that?
Sure.
I think you were made probably the first Muslim captain, but you were made on your merit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Elected on merit and just happened to be
Muslim.
Non-Christian and Muslim.
And woman.
Yeah. So that really, when I look back now, 40 plus years later, that really helped to shape me. It helped me to step into my potential that later became, I guess, my power. So then I went on to university and I studied a couple of degrees. I did an arts degree, I did a law degree. I worked for a number of years here in Australia, mainly as a criminal lawyer and a human rights lawyer. So I worked with some incredible communities that taught me so much about life and humanity. I worked with regional, remote, Indigenous communities, asylum seekers, refugees, victims of family and domestic violence, people that had become addicts and homeless due to extreme circumstances that had unfolded in their lives. And all the while, as I'm practicing law, after a few years there was this voice in my head that started getting louder that I couldn't ignore anymore. And I realised that eventually that this was the voice of my calling me to even higher duties. So eventually I would listen to this voice that wasn't going to quieten unless I did. And in the late 1990s, I left Australia and I went to the UK, and the plan was to do my postgraduate studies and to requalify and work as a Crown Advocate or a Solicitor Advocate or a barrister in the UK, and hopefully to carve my career into where I felt that I was being called, which was the area of humanitarian law. So that was the plan. After a number of years in the UK, I had finished my postgraduate studies. I was working in a big firm to pay the bills. I was volunteering at 2 human rights agencies, but I was getting frustrated and a bit disillusioned because I wasn't anywhere closer to accessing and serving and advocating for the people that I felt I was destined to help. And so I decided to have a bit of a circuit breaker, and I took 6 months leave of absence from my job, and I volunteered for and was lucky enough to be selected to go on a community aid expedition to South America. So I spent several months in South America, and that changed the course of my future. That expedition was supported by members of the British forces. And over the months that I was away, I made some very strong friendships with some of the army, in particular the army officers that were accompanying us on this expedition. And one in particular who became one of my closest friends, he sowed the seed and suggested to me that I should have a look into being a legal officer in the British Army. He explained to me that as a legal officer in the Army, I would have the opportunity to deploy to places in the world where people desperately needed humanitarian help and aid and advocacy. That there was also an opportunity as a military legal lawyer that I would be posted to The Hague, to the international tribunals. And he really sold the life of an army lawyer as being something that was full of adventure. I'd be travelling the world at a time when I was pretty disillusioned. So this sounded like a very attractive proposition. So I eventually returned from South America, and I do some research, and I decide on a not particularly special day just to put in an application, thinking in all honesty, what would the Army want with the likes of me? No family history or pedigree in the armed forces, you know, Muslim, female, a woman, lawyer. So I was completely shocked when many weeks later I received a call asking me to come for interview. I'd been shortlisted, and of course I said, "Thank you, sir," not realising the interview would last for 2.5 days, because that's how the Army rolls. And eventually I was called up again and told that I was accepted. So a number of months later, after preparing and training hard, I undertook my military officers course. And they say timing is everything. You would have heard that expression, and that turned out to be very relevant for me, because the week that I would graduate from my military officers course at Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy in England, that week that I would commission as a captain and a legal officer turned out to be the week of the 11th of September 2001, 9/11, as we've come to call that day. So that changed the whole world, as we know, and that also changed my world. So fast forward a number of years, and I've been deployed to a number of places around the world, to Northern Ireland, to Germany, to Scotland, to various places around Europe. And then, of course, by this stage, the Afghanistan invasion had happened, the Iraq invasion had happened. End of 2004, I get a call out of the blue advising me that I had been selected to deploy as the sole legal officer to Iraq the following year, the year of 2005. And it was explained to me that my role was twofold. First of all, to provide international military legal support to the British forces and the Allied forces based in Iraq, and also to work closely with the Iraqi authorities to help them rebuild, re-establish the rule of law and order in their country that had been left in a vacuum of chaos. And I was shocked. I was shocked to get this call, because the truth was that there was many legal officers in my corps that were much more experienced and senior to me. So I could not understand why I had received the call. And this was still fairly early on in the Iraq campaign. And I would be the first woman to carry out this role. And the cultural significance of that, coming from a Muslim background, hadn't escaped me. And I guess I reflected in those days afterwards, why me? Why did they choose me? And I was trying to surmise, was it because of my Muslim heritage? Was it because I spoke a little bit of Arabic? I didn't know for sure, but all I knew was that I had been given an incredible gift, an incredible opportunity to serve, and to serve people that desperately needed help. And so I had to step up and be worthy of that. So at the beginning of 2005, I deployed to Iraq, and that's where I served for the remainder of that year. And unbeknown to me at that time, my tour of duty in Iraq would profoundly change the course of the rest of my life, my practice, my leadership, and the way that I would walk through the world.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. Goodness me. In terms of the leadership, or the way you want to serve, how, because there's so many things there in your story. One of taking up the responsibility, and on the other end, one of somebody who's okay with self-abuse, but not okay with abuse of the brother, and that's when the voice comes out. There's so much ground to be covered in terms of being a leader from there to be an abused child, and then having a voice to see your family abused, and then taking a leadership position to frame the country's legal side of it. Can you draw me a bit more that how has this distance been covered internally rather than, yes, you have traveled South America, Europe, and Middle East, but that internal distance of being an abused child to a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. Let's see if I can do it justice with a good answer. And I think you separate it very well by, yes, I've travelled a lot, literally travelled a lot around the world. But I think the most profound journey has been the internal journey. People ask, are leaders born or made? And I have reflected on that question so much, and I think it's a combination of both. I think you can be born with some innate qualities and traits and develop some values that come from your DNA, but I think that life experience, mentors, role models can also shape you and help you to build and really solidify leadership qualities as well. In terms of me and my understanding of myself and my self-awareness, I think that part of my DNA was this really strong sense of values that I identified from an early age, part of which was no doubt influenced by my parents' experiences that I witnessed and the experiences that I went through, endured, suffered as well. It's interesting. I don't know whether I have a full answer to explain why I was able to suffer in silence when I was being abused and in receipt of the injustice, but then was motivated to speak out and find my voice when harm may come to others. I think if I was being raw with you, maybe that was an early sense of maybe unworthiness, feeling in those early days that perhaps I wasn't worthy of better, but being very clear that others deserved better. And that's something that has been a lifelong journey well into my 50s, which is the decade that I'm in now, is eventually through everything going on the personal journey to find my own self-worth and my own self-compassion and self-acceptance and self-love. That's probably been the work of the last several years. So that's been quite profound in itself. I think if I was to go back to those values, they have been the foundation of my leadership and my life and my calling and this drive and passion and hunger to serve others and to be the voice for others and to advocate for others. I guess I realised probably in my late teens, early 20s, because I'd been given the opportunity to step up and to lead and to use my voice, that I had a sphere of influence, that I did have the power to speak and to share stories. And even in those sort of younger years, when I spoke, people would listen. So I realised that that was a gift, and that was something that perhaps I could leverage for good. And that's perhaps how I think I built upon my leadership practice, my passion to use firstly the law as a vehicle, and then later the military as a vehicle to serve others. So that's probably how I would share with you my understanding of why I did what I did and then how I did it in terms of following my journey, because so much was unscripted in my life. I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to serve others and work in the area of humanitarian law and human rights. But leaving Australia, joining the military, going to South America, getting posted to Iraq, they're all things that they were choices that I made on the way as life unfolded. They weren't part of the grand plan. And I guess at every juncture when I was faced with difficult decisions or confronting situations or hardship or tragedy or loss, what kept me on the straight and narrow, what kept me returning to my true north, was this steadfast clarity around my values and my commitment to live my values as much as I could. And I guess at times that's what kept me alive as well. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but it's the best way I can describe it.
That tells me the strength of internal threads you have woven across the journeys you have been through. Can I ask you if you can elaborate your relationship with your father? How has that, because we are talking about internal strength, and we typically reflect on our parents, and as we observe them as our role models.
Of course.
Growing up, they are the closest role models we see growing up in the household.
Yeah, arguably our first role models, right?
Yes. And how has that, so what was that relationship with your father?
Yeah, well,
Start with.
Yeah, great question. So as we both identified, my first role models were my father and my mother. They were the ones, through their eyes, I saw the world initially. So I think my dad and my mum, but we're focusing on dad now, taught me a lot about dignity, grace, the importance to make space for humour at times, sacrifice. My dad sacrificed a lot for us, his family, leaving his country, which was familiar and comfortable, having to walk away from his love and passion and profession of flying. The sacrifices Dad made to literally change his life and turn it upside down for his family is something that stayed with me and absolutely has shaped me my whole life. So Dad was definitely my strongest, most powerful and earliest role model. He introduced me to the story and the work and the values of Gandhi, who became my hero and still is amongst other amazing heroes in the world that are my sources of inspiration. I think as I got older and I became an adult and I became a parent, my relationship with my dad and my parents became more complex. Because you get to that stage where you no longer see your parents as a child. You are an adult and you start seeing your parents as human beings, as fallible human beings. And there were things at that stage in my life that challenged me. Some of the decisions my parents made, some choices that they made that had had an impact on me. That took years for me to work through before I was able to get to the point of maturity and reflection and understanding and acceptance that Dad and Mum were doing the best they possibly could within their capacity. Because we're all the product of the sum of our experiences and culture and generation and beliefs, right? So that took some time to get to that point of acceptance and, dare I say, forgiveness. You know, when you migrate to another country, particularly as a first generation, you spend a large part of your life walking in two worlds. And that can be challenging. And often the two worlds collide and they conflict. And somehow as the first generation, and for me as the eldest by many years and the eldest daughter at that, and culturally that has a significance, certainly did in my life, to navigate that can bring some trials and tribulations. So the relationship with my dad was not always a perfect one or a harmonious one or a smooth one. I think that my dad was very challenged by the years when I was growing into adulthood and becoming a woman and wanting to explore and enjoy life as an Australian and wanting to explore the world and my own potential. And I was a questioner, I was curious, and I think at times that was confronting for Dad. But rightly or wrongly, unlike a lot of my other friends that were biracial, that walked in two worlds, I didn't choose to live two lives, one that would satisfy my parents and one that would keep me belonging and cool amongst my friends. I don't know why, but honesty and authenticity was always really important to me. And I felt that I owed it to myself to live one authentic life, to have to lie or make excuses or sneak around, because I didn't think that anything that I wanted to experience was wrong. And for better or for worse, that would see me land in great strife a lot of times with particularly my dad, who was challenged with letting go, who was challenged with trying to accept that there needed to be a merger of these two cultures, and that I was growing up and living in Australia, which was a very different environment to the one that he had been raised in. And so we clashed a lot. And that was hard at times, but I think it also made me the person that I was. And at the same time, you had this Australian culture of the tall poppy syndrome playing out that I was very, very conscious of, where I felt that I had to keep hiding my light under a bushel, that I knew there was this palpable expectation not to get too big for your boots. And I remember having this really strong sense in my 20s that I couldn't realise my full potential and I couldn't understand my full identity staying in Australia. I felt restrained. I felt a bit caged, and I felt as if there were expectations on me to keep small. And I think that was probably also one of the motivators to leave the country. And I can say to you quite honestly that I don't believe I would have got to a deeper sense of who I was, that I would have eventually embraced proudly my Muslim origin and heritage, and that I would have made some brave choices, some risky choices to put myself forward for certain things that I did in my career and in my life, had I not moved to the other side of the world and escaped this tall poppy syndrome, where I finally felt liberated enough and free enough to discover who I was. Perhaps away from my parents and the influence and the control there, but also away from the culture of Australia at the time.
I want to point out the dichotomy in the way your father has raised you. He has given you the strength to speak up.
Absolutely.
He's given you the strength of being honest.
Yeah.
But on
and
the flip,
very strong values.
And on the flip side, when you were honest with him, so then which would create all the friction came from what he taught you, and that's
Yes.
that's the dichotomy one has to live. That's life.
Yes, and that irony hasn't escaped me.
Yeah, that is permanent and that happens.
Yes.
And that's normal.
Yes.
That's life. That's being human.
But the children eventually become the teachers as well.
Yes.
And I know that has also happened
Yes.
in later life.
And going from there, with that context as those values and strength, when you were in Iraq, which is another, because you were probably traveled in Europe a lot, but when you're moving to Iraq and then staying there for more than a year, if you can paint that picture in terms of the resilience, the challenges, and what you did explore in that nation, what happened then?
So my time in Iraq in 2005, I could probably describe it as a tour of two halves. So the first 5-6 months, the environment was reasonably calm at this point. And so I was able to leverage that and spend a lot of time building trusting, respectful relationships with many Iraqi colleagues in the judiciary, law enforcement, law, and we were able to do some important work together. And I felt very privileged to work with them, to assist them, to re-establish one by one a lot of the structures that had been destroyed in terms of courts, prisons, police stations. But in about the July of 2005, everything changed. There was this infrared technology that had made its way across the border from Iran that was behind a lot of what we called IEDs, the explosive attacks that were now going off up and down the country. And they were killing thousands of civilians and hundreds of military personnel. Everything changed in I would say, that month of July. And the environment in Iraq became terrifying and extremely dangerous and volatile. And that's really when my resilience was tested. It became so dangerous that the International Red Cross were forced to pull out. So as a result, the British government appointed me as now their proxy human rights inspector. So I now had a third role. And this new role required me to conduct spot, unannounced visits and inspections on various facilities around the country. Facilities where we assumed and had some intelligence to suggest that human rights were being abused. So I now had to carry out 3 roles in what was very dangerous, volatile, terrifying circumstances. And I'm not overstating that. Every day just leaving the front gates of one's military base was an exercise in taking your life into your own hands. And I used to pray every morning that I'd be saved another day so I could try and do some good. And I remember praying every day, God, just give me the strength and the courage to make the right decisions so I can live another day. And that's how you lived from day to day. You dare not think about anything further down the track than that. So it was in that context, in the second part of my tour of Iraq, where I was involved in what became a fairly pivotal event in the Iraq campaign, that then changed the course of what happened to me from that day onwards. And it was the 19th of September in 2005. And early that morning, as I arrived at my headquarters in Basra at the airport, I received news that 2 of my colleagues, 2 British Special Forces soldiers, just a couple of hours earlier, had been kidnapped, had been beaten, and they were now detained. And they were detained at a place called Al Jamiat in Basra. And Al Jamiat was quite well known because it was the largest Iraqi police service headquarters. But by now, given everything that I've explained to you was happening in Iraq, it was also the largest headquarters for the Iranian-backed insurgency group that was behind the explosive attacks. And this group were called the Jaish al-Mahdi. Now, at this point, the Jaish al-Mahdi had completely infiltrated the Iraqi police service. So you had a situation in Iraq where the country was effectively being policed, controlled, governed even by terrorists, insurgents, many of them masquerading as police officers. And as part of this new third role, I had conducted inspections on Al Jamiat. So I knew that at any period of time, up to 300 innocent Iraqis were being illegally held there and tortured. So this wasn't good news, that our two colleagues were being held at this place. But there was nothing that I could do about it because I am just the army lawyer. This is not a situation that I'm trained for. This is not where my expertise lies. By now, and before I'd been deployed to Iraq, I had been promoted. So I'm now holding the rank of major, which is the first of the senior officer ranks. So I have a number of people reporting to me. But I also have a colleague who's based at the headquarters with me, same rank, his name's James. He was equipped and trained for this sort of scenario. So he was ordered by our commander to fly in via a helicopter to Al Jamiat to take a group of men to provide security for him and to do what was necessary to peacefully try and get our two guys out. So off James goes, and then about an hour later he sends a message back to our headquarters via a radio that he'd smuggled inside the compound. And he explains that the Iraqis had done something similar. They had sent their own representative into Al Jamiat, an Iraqi judge as it so happened. And James was desperately trying to start some negotiations and a dialogue with the judge, and the judge was not having it. The judge very plainly said to James, I don't know you, I don't trust you, I'm not speaking to you. And James realised that he had reached a stalemate. So he spoke to the judge through the interpreter that he had and asked the judge, who will you speak to? Because we know our two colleagues are here and leaving them here is not an option. And the judge eventually said to him, there is only one of you that has shown us respect, that has shown us humility, that I have some trust for. And the judge went on to say, while the rest of you were busy standing over us, pointing your finger at us, telling us what we needed and how we must get it done, that was only one of you that took the time to come and sit with us and eat with us and listen to us and ask us to share with them our concerns as well as our hopes and our dreams, and asked us how they could be of service to us. So James is listening to this and says to the judge, sir, who is that person? I will do everything in my power to try and get them here, if that is the only person you will speak with. And the judge said, that person is Major Rabia, which is what they called me. You send her in, I'll speak to her. Great. So off the back of that message that James sends to our headquarters, our commander orders me to get on the next helicopter, to fly into Al Jamiat, which was about 15 minutes chopper ride away, and to take over from James and to lead what we now understood to be hostage negotiations. And I was petrified, absolutely, literally shaking in my boots, because I wasn't trained as a hostage negotiator. I had no real expertise in this volatile situation. And I was convinced that I was possibly the worst person that he could have asked to do this job. I thought to myself, I am going to get myself, James, the boys, everybody killed. And I remember standing there looking at my boss thinking, okay, I'm going to single-handedly bring down the Iraq campaign. That's how bad a job I'm going to do. Bit exaggerated thinking, but you can imagine how terrified I was. And we were just speaking about Dad, when all of these thoughts came flooding through my head and I was quite literally frozen with fear, somehow like divine inspiration, Dad's words came to me. He used to talk to my little brother Adam and I as we were growing up about character. Character was something Dad used to speak about a lot. And I remember he used to say to us, kids, there'll be times in your life where you'll be called upon to step outside of your comfort zone and do something difficult, uncomfortable, for the greater good, when it really counts. And the decisions that you make in those moments when you are called upon will define your character. And you know, when you're young and you haven't really lived a life and those words of great wisdom don't have a lot of strong resonance. So you say, thanks, yep, thanks very much, cheers, Dad. And when I needed to hear it the most, like divine inspiration, those words come to me. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, I finally understood what my father was talking about. He was talking about a moment like this. So what was I going to do? Well, the ugly reality was there was no alternative. There was no choice to be made. Equipped or not, trained or not, I was being asked for, and 2 lives depended on it. So I had to take a deep breath and I had to dig deep and find the courage and do what was asked of me. So we flew in, and by the time I arrived at the Al Jamiat compound, there was now a crowd of about 300 locals that had swarmed and were surrounding the compound because they had been told by the insurgents who were running everything that they had captured Israeli spies. So the citizens of Basra believed that Israeli spies had infiltrated the region and were now inside, and you can imagine the frenzy. So by the time I arrived, about 100, 150 of my colleagues and friends, British soldiers, had been quickly sent to the site to try and keep the crowd calm. And the crowd was screaming for blood. They were firing their rifles in the air. They were now throwing glass and stones at the British soldiers. And the whole efforts were to try and stop a riot from erupting because they knew if control was lost, that would endanger everyone in the compound. So somehow I managed to jostle my way through this very irate crowd. James was waiting for me. We went inside. I greeted the judge. The judge greeted me in Arabic and turned to James and said to James, okay, you go now. And I didn't want James to go, right? Because he's my security blanket. He's the only one that I know well in this compound. And we're in this makeshift office and we're surrounded by these terrorist police officers. So you can imagine you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. So eventually I am able to persuade the judge to allow James to stay, but his condition is that James must keep his mouth shut. So I agree to that. Eventually, a little while later, I'm able to secure the judge's agreement to take us to where our 2 colleagues are being held. So we're marched right down the other end of the compound and we come upon this stone cell that has a big metal door. And the door's open and we're sort of shoved inside. And it's a dark cell with only light coming from a little slit of a window where the sun's beaming in. And we look around and eventually we see our 2 colleagues in the corner, and they've been bashed and they're bloodied, but thankfully they're alive. And their wrists and their ankles are in shackles, they're chained, and they have hoods over their faces, which is in breach of all the international conventions. So I immediately asked for the chains to be removed, for the hoods to be lifted. And that happens. And the 2 Special Forces soldiers sort of take a moment to let their eyes adjust, and they look around and they see the judge and they see the police officers and they see James, and they gave him a subtle nod because they knew him, and then they see me. And it's clear that I'm sort of standing in front next to the judge and that we're sort of assuming control. And they look at me and they can't hide their shock. They kind of recoil and they have this sort of frown on their face, and they look me up and down, and then they look at each other, and then they look back at me and they look me up and down again. And I knew what these poor chaps were thinking. You know, they were thinking, if she is the secret weapon, if she's the best the British Army have to offer us, then we're screwed. And I had some sympathy for that sentiment. But I couldn't say anything because I'm trying to maintain this, air of control and confidence along with the judge. So I just look at them and I just use my eyes to meet their gaze, and I just look at them and give them a sort of nod as if to say, I know what you're thinking and I'm so sorry. And yes, you're right, but I'm doing my best. So then over the course of the next probably hour and a half, I'd say, the judge and I are negotiating heavily. And we agree a set of conditions that I will meet, a set of actions that I will take, that I'm scribbling madly down on a piece of paper, in return for which the judge will release the men into my custody. So this scrappy bit of paper becomes, I guess, a hostage release contract of sorts. Eventually, we're just finishing agreeing the final action that I would be prepared to take. And I kid you not, the judge and I have pens in our hand and we're about to sign this contract when all hell breaks loose outside. The crowd now had grown to over 2,500. They were storming the compound and they had set fire to the soldiers that were sent to keep them calm. And I could see these flames from this little slit of a window, and you could feel the heat from the flames in the cell. The flames were that ferocious. I didn't realise, of course, until much later that they were the flames of my colleagues and friends outside on fire. So in what sounded like a herd of 1,000 elephants, when the crowd broke down the final wall, everything inside the cell changed in an instant. The police officers that were standing around now revealed themselves to be the terrorists that we suspected they were. And they grabbed their rifles and they cocked them and they pointed them at our 2 soldiers and James and I. The 2 soldiers were thrown back into the corner by these guards, these terrorists, and their chains and their hoods were replaced. James and I were grabbed by the scruff of our uniform shirts and we were dragged outside the cell, and the judge, looking around at what was going on, turned to me and quickly and quietly said to me in Arabic, "I'm sorry, Major Rabia, you and I, we no longer have control." And he grabbed his papers, put them in his briefcase, and he ran past me and ran away, and I never saw him again. Mm-hmm. James and I were physically dragged down the other end of the compound, almost to where we had started, and we were thrown into a cell. And we had probably about 15 of these terrorists guarding us. And within half an hour, the door to our cell burst open and 4 other guys were thrown in with us. They were actually British SAS soldiers. That in this chaos, they had tried to sneak their way in the hope that they would be able to grab us all and get us out. But they'd been caught and they were thrown in with us. And so now in our cell, we realised that we too had become hostages. And there's now 6 of us. And of course, I'm the only woman. I'm the only one that could speak a bit of Arabic. I'm the only one with Muslim heritage. All of which, up until that point, had helped in my service. But now, at the hands of these terrorists, I became the prime source of interest. And they saw me as the biggest traitor of all. And I could understand what they were saying to each other in Arabic. And they were calling me the whore, and they were talking about what they would do with me and the others. And for the next 8.5 hours, in front of my male colleagues in this cell, I was targeted, I was degraded, I was humiliated, and I was tortured. But miraculously, at the 8.5 hour point, we were all rescued in a combined British-American military operation. And it was a miracle, because not only were our lives saved, but we were able to reach the 2 original guys who'd been taken to another location just in the nick of time before they were about to be executed. So what should have been the end of the most traumatic experience of my life, unfortunately, unexpectedly heralded what would then become the biggest battle of my existence. Not because of what I endured in the cell, which was horrific enough, but as a result of how I was then treated by my employer after that. So to summarise that, we were flown back to our headquarters. By now it's early hours of the following morning, and all of my 7 male colleagues that had been held as hostages that day received a hero's welcome. A lot of backslapping, cheering. The whole headquarters had come together to receive us that morning when we arrived back. And all the men received, a lot of pride and celebration and happiness. Immediately after the celebration welcome, they were sent in for trauma counselling. We call it debriefing in the military. And I was told to hang back outside the headquarters building while this was happening. And I couldn't understand why. And I thought at one point, maybe I'm getting my own personal welcome on my own because of what I had endured. But that wasn't to be. When all 7 of my male colleagues then disappeared into a room for counselling, I was then ushered into the headquarters building, as I said, where hundreds of the headquarters staff had been asked to assemble. And there was no applause, there was no patting on the back, there was no handshakes for me. My commander came in true British fashion and greeted me with a cup of tea, much like this. He gave me a peck on the cheek. He'd never done that before. And then he gave me a hug. And he did this in front of all the headquarters staff, probably 60, 70% of whom also reported to me, because keep in mind I'm a senior officer now. And he then said to me, Siddique, you must be awfully tired. Run along back to your tent and don't hurry in this afternoon or tomorrow. So there was no debriefing, no counselling ever offered to me. There was no acknowledgement of the role that he had ordered me to perform, and there was no recognition of what I had endured for 8.5 hours in front of my male colleagues. And the silence in relation to all of those things continued and became deafening in the days and the weeks to come. And I was gobsmacked. I was so confused and at a loss. What had I done to deserve this treatment? And these feelings of confusion, as you can imagine, eventually gave way to feelings of anger and betrayal and abandonment. But I had to put this all to one side because I still had a number of months left to serve in Iraq. And there was Iraqis suffering and dying and being murdered. So I had to suck it up because I still had a really important job to do. And people that were suffering much greater horrors than me that I needed to help. And so I did the best that I could. And eventually at the end of that year, I was returned at the end of my tour to the UK, to England. But what I didn't realise until many months after that was that I returned a broken shell. I was empty by then. My cup was absolutely empty and I was broken. And I didn't realise how broken and how unwell I was until many months later. Through a number of turn of events, I then had a complete and utter breakdown.
Yeah, can't say a word. Wow. That 8.5 hours is a short time span just to endure what happened to you.
It felt like an eternity.
But I think the time after that, exploring that 8.5 hours piece by piece, I think that is way longer than that physical challenge or endurance you have to face through that limited time hour. But the expansion of that time space into across next coming period.
Yeah.
I cannot fathom or believe how you would have endured that. But if you could elaborate in terms of the inner talk, the inner expression or the inner conversation. And because I think that story of endurance and in self-work, people talk hush-mush self-love these days and all that fluffy stuff. But I think the real journey of internal self without external supports, how have you traversed that pathway and how have you untangled each pieces? I would love to understand that journey from there on.
Let me try and help to explain that. So eventually when I had my breakdown, and for you to understand what led to that, I think it's probably worth explaining what happened the following year. So early the following year, I was newly married. In fact, I had not long got married to my then husband before leaving for Iraq. So I return home and my then husband and I, realising how precious and fragile life is, and he is a Royal Air Force officer and he had already served in Iraq in 2003. So he understood to some extent the realities of what I had endured. We decided we didn't want to waste any more time and we wanted to start a family. And I was very blessed. I got pregnant quickly. But at the 4.5-month point, in a very extreme set of circumstances, I was diagnosed with a very rare form of ectopic pregnancy. And that almost cost me my life. So I was rushed to hospital. I spent quite a bit of time in hospital, a number of procedures and operations later. When I was still in hospital, one day my then husband was visiting me and he brought an envelope, an official-looking envelope to me that was addressed to me, sent to our address, and the envelope had 2 pieces of paper in it. And I opened the first piece of paper and I read it, and it was a citation. Remember me telling you about James?
Yes.
So James had been awarded a military cross by the then Queen Elizabeth II, and this was his bravery citation, and he had been awarded it for his efforts in the Al Jamiat incident. So I read this and I was thrilled for him, I was proud of him, I was so excited for him. And you can imagine what I'm thinking as I take out the second piece of paper from the envelope, and I'm shaking. And I open it up and I read it. And I read it and I read it again. It took 3 readings for me to understand what this piece of paper was, this second piece of paper. It was a written order to me from the Chief of the Defence Forces, so the most senior officer in the military, ordering me never to speak of the role that I had performed at Al Jamiat to anybody, inside or outside the armed forces. It's what we called a gag order. And when I read this for a third occasion, I had an involuntary flashback to 20 years earlier, to 9.5-year-old Rabia. And I remember thinking as I sat on my hospital bed, it's happening again. I'm being gagged and silenced again. And I remember thinking, is this what my life has come to? Is this all I have to look forward to? Is this as good as it gets? As a woman, as a Muslim, as a minority, as someone who has tried to overcome adversity and do some good. And I remember thinking, it can't be. Too much has changed. Not only am I 20 years older, but I'm educated, I'm articulate. I've dedicated my life to the law, for goodness sake, to fairness, to equality, to justice. And that's what I've been doing now for so many years. And I'm now a leader. And I have privilege. I have a voice. I have a sphere of influence. People look to me to lead by example, to lead with values, to lead from the front as a role model. And I remember thinking, I cannot allow myself to be gagged and silenced again, because if this is how I'm being treated with all my privilege and all my influence, God knows how other people are being mistreated that don't have the same opportunities and privilege and influence and voice and status as me. So I knew I couldn't allow myself to be gagged again. But life and its curveballs weren't finished with us yet, because 3 weeks after I was eventually discharged from hospital and returned to work, my then husband was diagnosed with cancer. And the prognosis wasn't great. He was given a 20% chance of surviving. So now wrestling with this, wondering what, if any, future we had, the nail in the coffin came out of the blue when I received a call from Iraq. A colleague of mine, a dear friend who was still serving out in Iraq, risked his career to secretly call me because he had news that he knew I would want to hear and that I deserved to hear. He rang to tell me that my closest Iraqi colleague, who'd become a dear friend, his name was Asaf El-Nahi. He was a judge's associate. He was married to the most incredible, intelligent, beautiful legal academic, and him and his wife had 2 beautiful, precious children under 4 that I'd met, that I'd spent some time with the previous year. My colleague rang secretly to tell me that that Asaf had been murdered, executed. And I knew instantly that I was largely responsible for his death, because I had convinced him the year before to work with me, to stand beside me in exposing the abuses of his people. And he so bravely worked closely with me. And when I was safely returned to the UK, the mark of that man's courage, he continued this work largely on his own because he believed so much in the importance of this work. And that's why he was shot twice in the back. And when I received this call, all I remember is looking down and seeing Asaf's blood on my hands. And all I remember thinking was I was the reason for why these two precious tiny children were now going to grow up without their daddy. And on that day, my world went black. And I remember dropping to my knees. And I didn't want to live another second. Because all I saw around me was darkness and chaos and misery and evil and injustice. And all I felt was pain. Sheer, debilitating, paralysing pain. And I couldn't go on. And for those people that are listening to us now, I'm sure that most of us have had a point where we didn't know whether we could go on. You know, whether it was tragedy, loss, injustice, overwhelm. We've all, I'm sure, had moments where we've wondered, can we carry on?
Yeah.
Do we have the strength? Do we have the will? But the fact that people are listening to us now means that they're still here with us. And so I guess for me, what I want to say at this point is I'd like to encourage people and you, because I'm talking to you and others hopefully, to reflect on those moments and ask yourself, who were the people and what were the things that held you in those moments? That comforted you, that gave you a reason and an incentive and a motivation to draw another breath, to take another step, to find the purpose to live another day and then another and then another, because they're the people and they're the things that we have to hold dear to us. You know, when we talk about this thing called resilience, they're the resources that help us to build resilience. And for me, thankfully, despite what he was going through, at that moment when I needed it the most, it was my then husband. And he literally lifted me off the floor. And he said the words to me, "My darling, you are broken and you need help." And that was a gift and a blessing because they were words that I needed to hear. And as a result of those words on that day, I then sought about getting the help that I needed. And it will be no surprise to you to learn that I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And that was a gift and that was a blessing because now my demon that had all but broken me had a name. And I could set upon the journey, the work, the pathway to confront the demon in order to overcome and heal. And thanks to some incredible professionals and people in my life, I was able to do that and to start making sense of what had happened. Now rebuilt and healed. And so now at that point, I was able to take the steps to right this wrong. And what I realised in the journey of trying to right this wrong was that what had led to my diagnosis and my breakdown and my almost complete destruction was not the harm that I endured for 8.5 hours, not the fact that I had on more than one occasion faced my mortality and what seemed like certain death in that time in the cell. That's not what broke me. What broke me was the complete loss of trust and the sense of betrayal and abandonment by people that I looked to and trusted to do right by me, to protect me, to value me, to advocate for me. In a very similar way to when I was a child. That was the parallel. And that was the motivation and the drive that solidified my resolve that I had to put this right. That I had to somehow find a way to hold these people to account, somehow find a way to speak truth to power, So that took 2 years. And I exhausted every informal avenue that was available to me within the armed forces. And at every juncture, the door was closed in my face until there was only one path left. And I knew it would mean the end of my military career. And I knew that it would cause me a lot of hardship. But I knew I had to take this path because now I wasn't doing this just for me. I was doing it for everybody that had been through something like me, that didn't have the resources that I had. And that was to mount a discrimination case against the army, which basically meant suing the British government for discrimination. So I agonised over that, and eventually that's what I did. And that took 1.5 years to get to court. And you can imagine the British government, the armed forces, they threw everything at me. And I went to hell and back more than once. But my resolve was pretty strong. And I lasted the distance, and I got my day in court. And my case was successful. But I think for me the biggest win was the impact that the ripple effect that my case had. Mm-hmm. Because after my case, in the months that followed, hundreds of discrimination cases then followed. Within 6 months of my case being heard, the first woman was awarded a military cross. And that fundamentally changed the whole dialogue about the role of women in the military as first responders. And within 1 year of my case being heard, there was an independent investigation into the armed forces. And that led to some pretty significant changes in legislation, in policy, in processes, and most importantly, in the culture and the attitude within the military around women, minorities, and military personnel that had suffered mental injuries. And those changes were largely replicated several years later into the British public sector. So that changed the course of my life and gave me probably the most life-changing, strength-bringing lesson of my life, which would be the power of the one. Mm-hmm. The power that we all have to create ripples of positive change. Mm-hmm. Because we all have that capacity within us. And fueled with that knowledge and that strength and that lived experience, I was then able to go on and to build upon my service to others, to humankind. I then went on for a number of years to prosecute terrorism and war crimes and hate crimes in the UK and in The Hague. Mm-hmm. Eventually, my then husband and I decided to move to Australia or move back to Australia after 1.5 decades away, mm-hmm. because a miracle had occurred after thinking that we would never have children, mm-hmm. after believing that my husband would never win his battle with cancer. He defied the odds and we defied the odds. And I ended up, through an IVF journey, falling pregnant with triplets. So I parent on steroids. I'm the mother of what are now 16-and-a-half-year-old triplet teenage boys. So we moved to Australia in 2011. And a little time after that, I was convinced and eventually agreed to share my story through a book. And through that book, which I'm very blessed resonated with a lot of people, I've been able to build upon my service, not just as a human rights lawyer, but now speaking, coaching, mentoring, training others to realise their capacity to build trust and to create positive change. So my story has a happy ending and it's still unfolding. I parent on steroids. I'm still serving. Mm-hmm. I'm doing my best to live my values, mm-hmm. and I live such a rich, meaningful life.
Wow. Oh. There's a book and a half, a couple of books there. Well, I think it's no less than a miracle plus the story of resilience and overcoming the challenge. Can I pick up from as in pick up from where you pick up the courage to sue the British government and the army? In that year and a half, as you said, you went to hell multiple times, not just once. Again, that the idea of parallel of 9-year-old Rabia to take your voice away and then gagging multiple times across your life period. How do you see that? Has your capacity to come back and raise your voice from being a 9-year-old child for your little brother growing up, raising your voice versus raising your voice with the big Goliath and the war? How is that similar? How is that intention to raise my voice and then bring my voice to being? How is that the intent, the initiation of that, yes, I want to stand up and say something. But this time is not for somebody else, but for me.
Yeah, that was harder.
Because you have raised voice multiple times in your story across this period for other people, and it probably came quicker and
natural.
easier.
Exactly. It felt natural. It felt like my calling to raise my voice, to use my voice to help others. I wrestled a long time with using my voice to help myself. And to be honest with you, the only way that I was able to get comfortable with that and make peace with that is because I knew that I wasn't just using my voice to get justice for myself, that I knew that this was far bigger than me. That if I was suffering the way I was, then goodness knows there was many, many others suffering worse. So if I'm being honest with you, it was probably still fueled by the fact that I was deeply aware that I wasn't just doing this for me, that I was doing this for others as well. But by now I had the maturity and enough of a sense of worth and awareness that I knew if I didn't advocate for myself, that no one else was going to. And I knew that this was going to be essential for my healing and ability to go on in the world. I knew that I was made of what I was made of, that I couldn't stay quiet, knowing that this injustice had been done to me and no doubt others, and just rolling over. So it was motivated by the fact that I believed I was going to be helping others and serving others as well. But I guess the difference was that now I was at a point in my life where I believed I was worthy of advocacy too. And looking around and realising that no one was going to protect or speak for me unless I was willing to do that first for myself.
In conclusion, if you can, for leaders out there across all platforms, whether they are in defense or whether they are in public service or corporates, everybody is in a way finding a meaningful voice of their own.
Yes.
And then try to connect their whole life story into a minimalistic, simplified version of what they stand for, what their values and beliefs are.
Yes.
And living their true purpose in what they do every day. And hence the motivation is permanent and longer term, not just one-off.
Absolutely.
What's the lesson you can pass on to those people who are in some way identifying or trying to find connections with their own self rather than the exterior but the interior?
Yeah. Well, there's a wonderful saying that has become one of my life mantras, which is to thine own self be true. And I think change has to come from within first. I think as leaders, we must take the time first to look within, to walk backwards into the future, to understand from whence we have come, who and what are the things and the people that have shaped and influenced and informed us, our values, our purpose, how and why we walk through the world. That is the only way we get a deeper sense of our own insight and awareness and identity. And then with that, getting clarity around what our values are, what legacy we want to leave, and how we want to impact other people, because ultimately it's about relationships. And committing to be true to those. And so that's my first piece of advice. Take the time to journey within yourself with a commitment to get a better sense of awareness of your identity and who you are and what has shaped and influenced you. Mm-hmm. And then when you have that, take further time to get clarity around what is important to you, what your values are, and what you believe your purpose is, and identify your influence, because we all have a sphere of influence, and it starts in our homes and our families and our community, right? And then set about committing to be true to yourself. Mm-hmm. In your life, in your work, in your leadership. And commit to embracing this capacity to impact positive change, however you can, starting with small steps. Because if every one of us does that, imagine the change that we can impact in the world at a time when goodness knows we need it more than ever. And I think if we were to commit, my one final thought is if we were to commit to anything as leaders, as change makers, it's trust. In the years and years that I've served people in all different sectors, from all different levels and backgrounds, doing a whole manner of different things in the world, the theme, the biggest challenge that comes up again and again and again is the erosion of trust. I think that is the biggest existential threat that we face in the world. Mm-hmm. The erosion of trust, the lack of trust in our leaders, in our institutions, in our politicians, in our organisations, in our companies. If we can all commit to doing something within and aligned with our values to rebuild trust, that's when we're going to turn the ripples into waves and turn this world around in ways that needs to happen for the next generation who are going to be inheriting this mess.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time.
You're welcome.
So glad. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.